Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are in lesson 4 of our Tanya shir. It's good to see old faces and new faces. I see some people who were trying to come because of time differences, and it's wonderful to see everyone, whoever I am catching here. And we spent 3 weeks learning the Sharblat, the cover page of the Tanya. We spent another 2 weeks studying the introduction, the Hakdama Samalakid, the Alter Rebbe's introduction to Tanya. But what we're going to do today is we're actually going to dig in straight to Parak Aleph, the chapter 1 of Tanya. And I'm sorry to break it to those that are expecting instant gratification. The way the Alter Rebbe teaches Tanya is that we're going to have a lot of questions, and the answers will not necessarily come until much later. So you got to bear with the Alter Rebbe as he takes us on this incredible journey. And it's a fun journey. It's a meaningful journey. It's an inquisitive journey. It's a journey full of curiosity, but we're not going to get quick answers. We're going to journey. Our soul is going to go through an incredible journey, and we will get to the answers as we go along. Let's start from a most basic acceptance or most basic recognition, and that is most Jews in their spiritual journey, and the Alter Rebbe understood this, most Jews in their spiritual journey feel like failures too often. And the Alter Rebbe is basically coming to respond to the chassid, to the person who's saying to himself or saying to his Rebbe, I feel like a failure. I feel like I'm constantly struggling. I feel like I'm wrestling with the divine, but I'm also wrestling with inner demons. I have good moments that I feel very close to Hashem. I have moments where I feel not so close to Hashem, and it makes me crazy that I don't have stability, that I'm constantly going back and forth. And so as we journey through Tanya, we're going to speak about the different forces that exist in the life of a Jew, spiritual forces, physical forces, materialistic forces, the multi-layers of consciousness that exist within a person. We're going to get to the most deep question, which is, who am I? And what do I want? What is this life all about? We're going to get to those existential questions, but that's going to take time. And of course, we'll get to self-awareness. We're going to get to the pros and cons of mental and emotional balance and limitations. But let's start from the beginning. The Alter Rebbe starts, like most rabbinic scholars, he starts with a quote from the Talmud. And he says as follows, for those of you that are in the Sefer Tanya, it's Parak Aleph. Tanya b'soif Parak Gimel Denida. The sages taught at the end of chapter 3 of Maseches Nida, the tractate of Nida in the Talmud, there's the following statement. Mashbiim oisei tihi tzadik v'al tihi rasha. That before a soul, before a child is born, before a soul descends into a body, they are administered an oath. They are made to swear an oath. And the oath is tihi tzadik, you should be a righteous person. V'al tihi rasha, do not be a wicked person. And then the oath continues. Va'afilu kol ha'olam kulei omer l'cha tzadik ata. Even if the entire world, everyone in your environment, everyone in your life is telling you that you are righteous, hey beinecha karasha, you should consider yourself like a wicked person, like a rasha. This is a Talmudic statement from a Brisa. I will circle back before we end tonight's class to give you a dose of novel Kabbalistic Hasidic interpretation on the actual word Tanya. But I don't want to get carried away with that now because I want to focus on what the Alter Rebbe is actually quoting from the Gemara. So the Gemara says that before a child comes into this world, before a child descends into a body, God administers an oath, and the word in Hebrew for administering an oath is mashbiim, from the word shavua. But it also comes from the word soiva, which means to sustain. In other words, we are not only given an oath and we're told, go figure it out on your own, but God gives that soul what it needs, the energetics, the sustenance that it needs to fulfill the oath that it's being administered. According to some of the Rabbeim, the Chabad Rabbeim, the obligation to help that oath come to fruition is actually on the parents, because a young soul has no real idea of how to activate an oath that it made in heaven. So it's the parents' job to kind of help that child activate and actualize the oath that it took while it was in the heavenly abode before it descended into this world. And so it's an injection. God gives a soul an oath. It is injected with purpose. It is injected with meaning. It is injected with the ability to be a tzaddik, to be a righteous person, and not to be a rasha. But then the second part of the oath is that even if everyone's telling you that you are a righteous person, don't consider yourself righteous, consider yourself wicked. Now, it should be mentioned, because it needs to be mentioned, that if there's a tzaddik in this world, if there's a righteous person in this world who knows that they are a tzaddik, they know that they are righteous, not because someone else told them that they're righteous, but because in Judaism, especially in Hasidism, we believe wholeheartedly in having a healthy, honest recognition of who you are, both your pros and your cons, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so if someone happens to know that they have the status of a tzaddik, that's wonderful. We're not talking about that. The oath has nothing to do with someone who recognizes their self-worth and recognizes their spiritual status as a tzaddik. We're talking about if you don't know yourself what you are, but people around you are constantly telling you that you're a tzaddik, so it's coming from the outside. The Gemara is warning us that the oath that the soul is administered is forewarning that issue and telling us, don't get convinced. You should always see yourself as wicked. Now, if you study the Talmud and the Tractate of Nida, and all you heard was that your soul got an administered oath that you should be righteous and not be wicked, okay, big deal. I got the energetics, I got the divine inspiration, I got the intentionality. I'm going to be righteous and I won't be wicked, and I should also never consider myself to be righteous. It sounds like a little dose of humility. Don't ever consider yourself righteous if people tell you that you are. But the Alter Rebbe starts off Tanya by quoting this statement in the Talmud, this brisa, and says that Tzarich Lahavin, we have a seemingly an apparent contradiction. So there's a need for clarification. The Tnan of his Perik Beis Valti Roshim from the Atzacha, because there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos in the Ethics of Our Fathers that says, don't consider yourself to be a wicked person. So first of all, how do you reconcile that contradiction? How is a person supposed to see themselves? And I'm not going to, journey into the reality of today's world of psychology and pop psychology of, self-worth versus self-dignity versus self-aggrandizement versus egomania. There's layers and layers of how people see themselves and how they should see themselves. From a most basic understanding, based on the tractate in Nida, it says that you should always consider yourself a rasha, and in Pirkei Avos it says you should never consider yourself a rasha. And the Alter Rebbe takes that contradiction and exacerbates the question. How does he exacerbate the question? He says, "V'gam, furthermore, im yiyeh be'einav karasha, if you do consider yourself like a wicked person, which is what the tractate in Nida, what the Gemara in Nida is suggesting, we have a double prong issue that happens if you consider yourself or see yourself as someone that's wicked. Number one is v'yera levav v'yeh atzev. You will become downhearted and depressed. You will not be able to worship God joyfully and positively. So on the one hand, if you follow what the Tractate of Nida says, that you should see yourself as wicked, number one, it contradicts Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avos, but more importantly, in our actual service of Hashem, being down on yourself, seeing yourself in a negative light and always seeing yourself as a rasha is a recipe for spiritual malfunction. Why is it a recipe for spiritual malfunction? Because we are obligated to serve God b'simcha v'tuv levav. There's a biblical commandment in Deuteronomy and Dvarim that a Jew needs to serve God with joy, both when they fulfill the positive mitzvahs, the mitzvahs aseh, and also when they refrain from transgressing the mitzvahs loisaseh, the negative prohibitions. So if that's the case, then why would seeing yourself as a rasha be anything good come from it? It doesn't seem logical at all. But then he goes further and he says, if it goes the other direction and you don't feel bad about it at all, so you say to yourself, I know that I'm a rasha, but I'm not taking it to heart. I'm not taking it to heart because it's going to make me sad. It's going to make me upset. It's going to make me depressed. It's going to make me feel down. So if he doesn't take it seriously, he'll end up becoming flippant, God forbid. He'll end up becoming flippant. And what happens when you become flippant? What happens is that you end up in the situation where you're blaming everyone else for your spiritual maladies. It's this one's fault, it's that thing's fault, as long as you're not blaming yourself, because what you're doing is doing everything in your power not to end up becoming depressed. So the Alter Rebbe recognizes that this approach of the Gemara, of the Braisa Masechta Nida, is a disaster waiting to happen. Because on the one hand, either you'll be totally depressed, which is not good to serve Hashem, or you won't be depressed at all. You'll blame the whole world for your problems. You'll be a happy camper. You won't take it too seriously. And you'll have the best of intentions for why you're not getting upset about it, why you're not taking those spiritual maladies seriously, but it's going to end up being the source of your downfall. So the Alter Rebbe continues and says as follows. To understand this, we need to understand another Gemara, the Gemara in the Tractate of Brachos. And here's where it gets a little tricky. And honestly, a lot of people that start learning Tanya, when they get to this section, they get a little confused, and by the time they check out, we're done. Don't check out. In Yiddish, we say, "Halt cup," keep track of what the Alter Rebbe is about to say. When we look in the Gemara in Brachos, it says about there's 5 categories. What are the 5 categories of Jews? Tzaddik v'toivloi, a tzaddik who has it good. Tzaddik v'raloi, a tzaddik who has it bad, straight up. Rasha v'toivloi, a rasha who has it good. Rasha v'raloi, a rasha who has it bad. And a Beinani, which is the focus of this entire sefer, the Beinani, what we will call, and I like it, I think I saw it first in Chaim Miller's Tanya, the term in-betweener. The in-betweener. So you have, if you understand the Gemara on the most simplistic level, there are 5 types of Jews. There are Jews that are spiritually righteous and they have it good in this physical world, meaning their life materially and physically is blessed as well. You have righteous people who are spiritually righteous, but they have a rough physical and material life. Then you have Rishoyim, wicked people, who have a good physical and material life, even though spiritually they're a total disaster. You have Rasha v'raloi, you have wicked people who are spiritually unhealthy and physically, materially unsuccessful. And then you have this category that we're going to spend the next couple of years journeying through, the Beinani, the in-betweener. Now, when you learn the Gemara on a most basic level, it seems like there's a direct correlation between the spiritual reality and the physical material reality of these particular people. We don't know exactly how it plays out, but that's what it seems like. But the Gemara goes back and forth to try to understand what exactly it means. And then the Gemara says as follows, Upirshu b'Gemara. And the Gemara explains over there, Tzadik v'toivloi tzadik gamur, that when we say that there's a righteous person who has it good, who enjoys fortune, that is referring to a tzadik gamur, to a totally righteous person. But when it says tzaddik v'raloi, that there's a righteous person who does not have the great fortune when it comes to materialism and physicality, that is a tzaddik she'eni gamur, that is a tzaddik who is not totally righteous. In other words, when you learn the Gemara initially, you think that it's only a physical manifestation of whatever their spiritual state of being is. What the Gemara explains at the end is that there's a difference in the tzaddik's status between being a tzaddik gamur, a complete tzaddik, and obviously throughout Tanya we're going to get through what that exactly means, and what it means to be a tzaddik she'eni gamur, to be an incomplete tzaddik. What is certain is that it becomes very clear that it's talking also about an inner reality difference between a tzaddik gamur and a tzaddik she'eni gamur. It's not just some superficial difference. There's a real essential difference between a complete tzaddik and an incomplete tzaddik, and of course we're going to get to understand that as we go along. But the Alter Rebbe doesn't suffice with the Gemara's conclusion. Because when you open up the Zohar, and I mentioned in the Akdamas Amalakit that of course the Alter Rebbe quotes the Zohar, even though it wasn't, when we say Mipi Sfarim, Mipi Soifrim, that are specific teachers and books that the Alter Rebbe used as a foundation, that's in addition to the basic Talmudic, Mishnaic, Zoharic teachings of the Torah. And so the Alter Rebbe immediately quotes the Zohar. What does the Zohar say about these two categories? V'raya mehemna parshas mishpatim. And in the section of Zohar called Raya Mehemna on Parshas Mishpatim, so it's coming up in a few weeks, it says, Tzaddik v'raloi. What does it mean, a tzaddik who has it bad? When the Gemara says that there's a certain type of Jew that's a tzaddik v'raloi, that they are a tzaddik, they're righteous, but their life is bad. What does that mean? Shehara sheboy kofuf latoiv v'chulu. It means that the bad within them is suppressed by the good. So according to the Zohar, suddenly, the bad of the tzaddik is not referring to that their life is bad, that their fortune is bad, that they have something physical or material, but internally, they still have this thing called bad, but the bad is totally controlled, or it's in halachic terms, it's bottled to the good that exists within them. It's suppressed. The tzaddik has such righteousness that the negativity, that the bad that exists within them is suppressed by the good. So yes, it may manifest itself in the physical world as well, but we now define that there's a tzaddik who is not suppressing the bad because there is no bad, and then there's a tzaddik who still has bad and it's being suppressed. Now, we have a better understanding now between the difference between a tzaddik v'toivloi and a tzaddik v'raloi, a tzaddik who has good and a tzaddik who doesn't have good. What we don't have a better understanding yet is what is a beinoni? What is this in-betweener? And to try to understand what the beinoni is, the Alter Rebbe goes on a little bit of an explanation from the Gemara, but that only makes the question even stronger. And in case you're wondering, I won't leave you tonight without illustrating exactly what 3 questions we want to answer next week. I'm not just going to leave you with a bunch of random comments and questions. We're going to have clarity. But it's not going to be clarity with answers. It's going to be clarity with questions. We're going to at least know what the questions are that we need answered. So the Alter Rebbe starts addressing the beinoni. And this is the first moment where he begins this journey of trying to comprehend and ingest what is this character called a beinoni. And the quicker we, mean both we that were in the Alter Rebbe's days when he wrote the Tanya, and every single one of us learning Tanya, the quicker we have a grasp and an internalization of what a beinoni is, the better off we are in our own service of Hashem, because honestly, from 99.9% of us, we can't serve Hashem unless we know what our service is, and to know what our service is, we need to know what a beinoni is, because that is something that we strive for. So the Alter Rebbe says as follows, of Gemara, Soif Perek Tes the Brachas. If you open up the Talmud, the Gemara and Brachas at the end, in chapter 9, says, Tzadikim Yetzer Toiv Shoiftam. Righteous people, tzadikim, are the internal judge of a righteous tzaddik. The internal nudge in a righteous tzaddik is the Yetzer Toiv, is their good impulse. Rishoyim, in the case of wicked people, the Yetzer Hara Shoiftam, the guide, the nudge in their soul, the direction in which they are heading is being pushed by the evil inclination, by the impulse of evil that exists within them. But Beinan in the Gemara says, Zev is a Shoiftam, a Beinani, the in-betweener is both, he has a good impulse and a bad impulse, like every human being, and in his case, both of them are his internal judge. Both of them are nudging him, sometimes in this direction, sometimes in that direction. For right now, we're going to leave that Gemara as is. We're not going to get into the depth of it right now. But there's clearly an impulse for good in every person. There's an impulse for bad. A tzaddik has the impulse for good, judging and guiding them. The Rasha has the impulse of bad, guiding them. The Beinani has both. In the Gemara there then becomes a very interesting, confusing statement that goes on. What is the next statement in the Gemara? Amar Rabba kegoyin ano beinani. Rabba hears this. Now we're talking about Rabba. Rabba was the Rosh Yeshiva of Pumbedisa. He was the head of the yeshiva, of the grand Talmudic yeshiva in Pumbedisa in Babylon. He was one of the greatest sages of Klal Yisrael in Bavel, in Babylonia. So Rabbah hears this. He hears that there's a tzaddik that is guided by the good impulse and judged by the good impulse. And he hears that the Rasha is guided by the evil impulse. And that there's a Beinoni who has both, and they both direct him in different days and different hours and different moments. And he says, me, Rabbah, someone like me is a Beinoni. I'm an example of someone who's an in-betweener. There's no reason to accuse Rabbah of having some kind of false humility. If he said that, he meant it. And even if he was trying to be humble, he wouldn't be humble to the point where it would be unrealistic. He wasn't trying to play a game. So if Rabbah, the great sage, says, I'm a Beinoni, his nephew, Abaya, who was also his prime student. So Abaya considered Rabbah, his uncle, as his Rabbi Muvak, his prime teacher of Torah. And he was a Talmud Muvak of his uncle. So he says to his uncle, to his rabbi, Amar le Abaya, Abaya says to Rabbah, Lo shavik mar chaya l'chol bir v'chulu. Master, my dear Rebbe, you're denying everybody life. Because if you're an in-betweener, it means there's no righteous people in this world. And it means every one of us who is so much lower than you can never strive, can never even think of attaining a level of being a Beinoni. What does it mean if you're not a Beinoni, if you're not an in-betweener? It means you're a Rasha. So your statement that you're a Beinoni is really, really a challenging statement for humanity, for the Jewish people. Now, if it ends up being true that Rabbah truly meant that he was an in-betweener and the most simplistic level, then we have to reconcile that. But the Alter Rebbe, obviously, and we're not going to do that today, but the Alter Rebbe is going to go on next week to explain to us that there's the simplistic understanding of what it means to what it means to be a Beinoni, some mediocre, neutral force in between good and evil, versus what it truly means in the essential term. And then it would make more sense that Rabbah would think of himself that way, but that we're way ahead of our game. We will get to that. For now, it is clear that we don't have clarity in what a Beinoni is. And the Gemara that the Alter Rebbe quoted only makes it more problematic, because Rabbah's conversation and Abaya's response makes it clear that we need much more clarity as to what this level of piety that we call a Beinoni versus a tzaddik v'toivloi, a tzaddik v'raloi, what is the essence of this Beinoni, and how does their life play out in real time as it relates to their spiritual journey? If that wasn't enough, right? Because as of right now, we have three questions. Number one, if I fulfill the oath administered to me at birth, that I should always see myself as a Rasha, how will I remain positive and joyful in my service of God? That's question number one. Question number two, what's the real difference between all these categories of tzaddik, Rasha, and Beinoni? And number three, what logic led Rabbah to think that he was a Beinoni, that he was an in-betweener? So again, three questions. How can I always consider myself a Rasha if we know that that's going to ruin my service of God? Number two, what exactly is the difference in these five categories? And number three, how does Rabbah think of himself as a Beinoni? Now that we have those three questions, the Alter Rebbe comes now and throws in a wrench and adds another question. And this question is a really good one. It's a theological question that baffles people, because I can say this as a shliach. It's probably the most complicated theological question we ever get, is how do you reconcile free choice and divine providence? And it's a good question. And there's many ways and layers of trying to understand it, but Alter Rebbe touches upon this in this last question that we're going to study today. And he says as follows. One last question as relates to the concept of determinism. We need to understand that which Job says. It's quoted in Bava Basra, chapter 1, page 16, Tazayin. Ribono shel olam, master of the universe. Barasa tzadikim, barasa reshoim chulu. You have created righteous people and you have created wicked people. right? Job is the master. Eob was the master of theological challenges. The sufferer of all sufferers. He had a lot of questions, and he talks about how God created oxen. He was talking about the unfairness of the world. God created an ox with split hooves, and he created a donkey without split hooves. He says you created this type, and you created heaven, and you created purgatory. And then he says you created wicked, and you created righteous, and you created wicked. Now, the Alter Rebbe uses the word chulu, so he's referring to the rest of the conversation, which is when Job's friends, Eob's friends, responded to him and said, "Barasi li Yetzirah, barasi li Torah tavlin." They said, yes, God created a Yetzirah, an evil inclination in every person, but he also created the antidote for that, which is Torah. And then the famous statement, in Pagav you find that disgusting creature, the evil inclination, schlep him into the base medrash. In other words, Torah is the antidote to the evil inclination. But it doesn't answer the theological question that the Alter Rebbe is about to ask. The Alter Rebbe is saying that Eob made it clear that God created wicked people and created righteous people, those who have an evil impulse and those who don't. But we have a direct contradiction from another Talmudic statement. What's the other Talmudic statement? It says clearly in the Gemara Nida, it says that before a mother and a father conceive a child, before the mother conceives, God decides if that child is going to be rich or poor. God decides if that child is going to be weak or strong. God decides if that child is going to be wise or what's the opposite of wise? I have to be careful. Stupid. Not so wise. But it says clearly in the Gemara that God does not decide if that child is going to be right, tzaddik or rush or righteous or not, because that would take away their free choice. Right? Everything's in the hand of heaven except for being God-fearing. Our choice to be a God-fearing person is up to us. So now that we're talking about this whole concept of righteous versus wicked and a Beinoni, the Alter Rebbe throws in a fourth question, which is how do you reconcile what Job said, what Eob says, and what the Gemara says about a child and how they come into this world? So we have four questions that need answers, and Be'ezer Hashem Yisborach next week we're going to start the answers. But as I promised, I want to loop back to the beginning because it's very important, right at the beginning of Tanya. And this is discussed. The Rebbe discusses it directly in his commentary on Tanya. It's also printed in the Tanya Sholem. I think other of the Chabad Rebbeim touch on it as well. It's very fascinating to me. And I'm giving you a short synopsis of something that, in this one particular drash from the Rebbe, it's a pretty, also maybe from the Tzemach Tzedek, it's a very extensive, long back and forth, but this is the synopsis. Alter Rebbe begins the words with Tanya, quoting a Brisa. Except if you look in the Gemara Nida, it says Darash Rebbe Simloi. It's quoting a Talmudic statement from the sage Rebbe Simloi, and it's not quoted as a Brisa. Now, it's quoted in other places as a Brisa, and that is a common theme in Gemara, that you will quote a Gemara, even though in that particular location that you're quoting, it may be a Brisa, or may not be a Brisa, but somewhere else it's a Brisa. So it's not an unheard of concept, and the Rebbe actually gives multiple examples of where we see this play out, but it still doesn't answer the main question. Why? If the Gemara itself says Darash Rebbe Simloi, that the sage Rebbe Simloi taught us, why not just quote it as is? Why do we have to make a whole pirush out of it? Just quote it as it is from the Gemara. Unless there's another important reason for why the Alter Rebbe felt specifically that he wanted to use the word Tanya, which means Brisa, as a starting point of Tanya. And of course, there is a reason. There's a Sefer Oyer HaGonuz. It's a Kabbalistic Sefer. I mentioned it, I think, in lesson 1 or 2. It was written by Rabbi Yehuda Leib HaKoyen, one of the people who wrote the approbations for Tanya, a student of the Maggid. It's a Kabbalistic Sefer called Oyer HaGonuz. In Sefer Oyer HaGonuz, he quotes from the Arizal, from the Holy Ari, that there's a Kelipah, there is a force of negativity that is called Tanya. That when God created the forces of Kelipos, the forces of of evil, of negativity, of all of that Sitra Achra in the world, there is one of those Kelipahs is called Tanya. And in order to combat the Kelipah called Tanya, the Alter Rebbe insisted in starting the Sefer, which is going to be the antidote to Kelipah. It's going to be the prescription drug for spiritual maladies in the generation prior to Mashiach's arrival. He wanted to start it with the word Tanya to give us the energetics, to give us the bracha, to give us the guidance and how to overcome and transform and get rid of the negativity of Tanya, or at least transform it into a holy reality. Which also explains why he's so specific in saying Soif Perek Gimel Denida. He starts off saying that this brisa, this teaching, is at the end of the 3rd chapter of Nida. Why couldn't it just say Tanya? We learned in a brisa. Since when does it have to say the location and the exact? Tanya in Masechta, it has to say Tanya Soif Perek Gimel Denida in the 3rd section of Nida. Says the Rabbeim say something so beautiful. They say as follows. The Zohar says that the leg and the foot of a person is divided into 3. You have the thigh, the quad, then you have the calf, and then you have the ankle foot area. And the Zohar talks about Kabbalistically with the spheres how each section represents a different emotion, a different spiritual light. But when the Alter Rebbe says, what is Nida? Nida is a time when a husband and wife cannot be together. There's impurity. Nida, right? If we look in Megillas Eicha, when we read Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, Nida refers to the Jewish people in their state of exile. L'nida haisa, we were in a state of Nida, a state of impurity, a state of exile. Our husband, our God, our spouse can't be with us. We're in a state of Nida. So when it comes to Soif Perek Gimel Denida, when it comes to the Soif Perek Gimel, which is the ankle, the ikvus of the Mashiach, the final time prior in this Nida state, you're getting closer. We're getting very close to mikveh night. We're getting very close to when the husband and wife can get back together, where God and the Jewish people can reunite in their marriage. But we're not there yet. So the Alter Rebbe is saying that when are you going to need this Tanya most? The Soif Perek Gimel Denida, when you get to that time in Jewish history, when we're so very close to Mashiach's coming, and it's almost time for the unity of God and the Jewish people, the bride and groom, the Chassan and Kala, Zon, Malchus, the Eibishter and us, to be reunited, for the mikveh experience to come into fruition and the unity, the purity to reign freely. That is a time when Tanya is going to be needed most. And that's why Tanya, this Kelipah, is transformed from Tanya. What other word is formed from those 4 letters, Taf, Nun, Yud, Aleph? Esam. Esam means strength. Avram Avinu was called Esam. And so we have the ability through studying, but not just studying, through studying and internalizing and living with Sefer HaTanya, we have the ability to transform our spiritual journey into one of strength, into be a state of Esam, a state of steadfast, foundational strength in our relationship with God. And that takes work. See, he said, I came to a Tanya class on Thursday night, Yud Aleph Shvat, and all I got was a bunch of questions and contradictions from Gemaras and Nida and Brachas and a little bit of Bava Basra. The answer is yes, because if you want to find the truth, you want to find the journey that will get you to internalization and spirituality, that will heal the maladies, that will actually deal with the inner demons and the darkness, and will allow you to know how to deal with those feelings of failure. Because feelings of spiritual failure generally do not lead people to anywhere good. It generally leads us to pretty negative things. That will happen when we study Tanya and we enjoy the journey and we think about it, meditate on it, and allow us to become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the process. And the answers to these questions, Be'ezer Hashem Yisbarach, will come next week. And I look forward to seeing you then. Sei gesund.